Okay, all right. Good afternoon, or actually, good morning. Thank you so much for being part of the Friday's contract class. My name is Simon Casades, team leader, broker for the KW South Bay, and broker for the Long Beach coastal office as well. So today we're going to be talking about assigning contracts. The key element to understand assigning a contract is a twofold position. One, I get asked a lot if a contract can be assigned, and the answer is yes. You can definitely assign a contract to your own entity, S Corp, C Corp, LLC, and also you would have to get permission from the seller if you or your client is assigning it to any other person. So we're going to dive deep into the conversation that ultimately will provide you with the actual language that's on the RPA, and then also the form that you need in order for you to accomplish an assigning of contract. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive deep into this. So let's get started. So assigning a contract, sometimes during the course of the transaction, a buyer may need to assign all or a portion of their interest in the contract, right? You submit an offer as, let's say, Simon Casades, and during the escrow period, you decide, or I decide that I want to transfer it into my S Corp, C Corp, LLC, or a trust. The agreement allows you to do so. This could mean swapping out one buyer from another, a total assignment, adding an additional buyer to the existing one, or a partial assignment, or deleting a buyer or replacing a buyer with at least one original buyer remaining on the assignment. In each case, buyers under the residential purchase agreement have a limited right to assign their interest in the contract as long as they follow the appropriate procedure. Okay, so the appropriate procedure is the right to assign under paragraph 23 of the RPA. Paragraph 23 of the RPA lays out the procedure for assignment to take place. If the buyer is assigning all of their interest to either one, right, their own trust, or two, any wholly owned entity, a buyer that is in existence at the time, then the buyer has the right to make the assignment and does not need seller consent. In any other circumstances, buyer may not assign the contract without first getting the separate written consent of the seller to the specific assigning, meaning you're submitting an offer, your offer gets accepted, and now you want to assign it to someone else, okay? It has to be in writing and it has to be agreed upon by the seller. You cannot, and I want to repeat, you cannot assign your interest on the property to another party without the seller's consent, and it has to be in writing, okay? The seller consents cannot be unreasonably withheld, okay? Under the RPA, it talks about the assignment. We're not going to go into it right now, but I will also populate the purchase agreement, and then we'll go and explore Form AOAA as well. The right to assign under the paragraph 23 of the RPA. When making an assignment request, okay, this is again, if the buyer is requesting to assign it, they must first disclose the name of the assignee. Okay, who are they assigning it to? Disclose the amount of any monetary between buyer and assignee. We're seeing a lot of issues and concerns when it comes to buyer assigning it, or basically called wholesaling. Okay? Now, based on the interpretation of the agreement, it stipulates that if a buyer wholesales it to another buyer and there's a spread of difference, I tie up the property, for 800,000. I decide after doing my due diligence, I don't want to buy it, but I don't want to lose the contract, right? Then I can assign it under the written approval of the seller to assign it to someone else, because I still want to take possession or at least have some control. I can assign it to another end user, right? But what the contract says that if I'm going to be making a profit, such as I buy it for 800,000, but then I assign it for 810, there's a $10,000 wholesaling, what we call wholesaling fee, right? 800,000, 810, I give it to another person or another buyer that will ultimately close the deal. Okay. That's what we call wholesaling it or assigning it to someone when there's profit to be made. Now, I caution you as well, because these can be a little tricky because we have to be full, transparent, but more so, we also have to disclose to the seller the difference that you're going to make. If you don't, then it is crossing boundaries and unethical practice. And you may be disciplined by not just the California Association of Realtors, but the Department of Real Estate as well. So I want you to understand that if you're the listing agent and you get an offer from someone that submits an offer and now they want to wholesale it or transfer it or assign it to someone else for a profit, they have to get first and foremost the approval in writing by the seller. If the seller says no, then the buyer cannot assign it to someone else. The only thing that the buyer can do is assign it to its own entity, okay? Its own entity, meaning its corporation, S Corp, C Corp, LLC, or a trust. That's perfectly fine. That's still within the means of the buyer buying this property, okay? Disclose the amount of the monetary consideration between the buyer and assignee. Provide assignee with all documents related to the transaction. And ensure that the assignee will provide a letter from the assigning lender that assignee is pre-qualified or pre-approved as specified on the RPA. So for example, if buyer one assigns it to buyer two gets the written approval from the seller, we must provide the form, right? The AOAA form, knowing if there is going to be some type of monetary between buyer one and buyer two. On top of that, buyer two must also provide, its position, if it's a cash deal, if it's a hard money deal, or if it's a traditional finance involved, right? Conventional, FHA, or VA, the second buyer would have to provide all that. If it's a cash deal, proof of funds must be also part of the attachment, so that way the seller knows if this second buyer will be able to close or not. Just because buyer one assigns it to buyer two doesn't mean that buyer two is going to close. Remember, at the end of the day, folks, there is a deposit in escrow, right? There's a deposit in escrow. So you have to be very cautious in how you navigate this approach if you are the listing agent, okay? All right, so the right to assign under the paragraph 23. If the buyer does not deliver the assignment request and satisfy the above requirements within 17 days of acceptance, or whether time specified, right? It could be 17 days, it could be 10 days, it could be 5 days, whatever time agreed upon, right? Whatever, then the seller withholding of consent to the assignment shall be deemed reasonable. Okay, reasonable. All right, so if there was an agreement between buyer one that there was going to be an assignment or within the buyer's contingency period. And part of the RPA has a grid, right? The grid on paragraph 3, page 1, page 2, and page 3. The buyer has within their due diligence period to ultimately, continue, assign it, or back out of the deal. The use of the assignment of agreement amendment. Okay, here we're going to go into the assignment of agreement. To make the assignment request and to complete the assignment itself, the buyer shall, right, or should use the assignment agreement amendment form AOAA. The form AOAA form has spaces for the buyer to indicate the name of the assignee, whether the assignment is total, partial, or other, and whether or not the buyer is receiving consideration for the assignment. What is consideration, right? If the buyer, number 1, is getting any type of compensation from buyer number 2, that is considered consideration. Paragraph 2 of the AOAA defaults to state that a copy of the pre-qualification, pre-approval, and any additional copies of all prior documents are attached to the form. The buyer may elect to deliver prior documents to the assignee 3 days after the seller signs and delivers back the AOAA form in paragraph 2A. Okay, I want to repeat it one more time. Paragraph 2 of the AOAA defaults to state that a copy of this pre-qualification, pre-approval, and any additional copies of all prior documents are attached to the form. The buyer may elect to deliver prior documents to the assignee 3 days after the seller signs and delivers this form. Okay, here's an example of what the form looks like. The assignee is required to initiate the first page of all prior documents, which can be done with the AOAA or within a time specified in paragraph 2C2. If the prior documents are not delivered on a time and or on pre-qualification, pre-approval is not attached to the AOAA form, the seller may deliver what's called a notice to perform and sequentially has the ability to cancel the agreement or cancel this assignment, right? Remember, there has to be a written agreement that if a buyer, which in this case, buyer 1 assigns it to another buyer, buyer number 2, and buyer number 2 is going to close the deal, 1, it has to be approved by the seller. 3, the AOAA form must be also included. Any and all prior documentations must be delivered, and if not, the seller and the listing agent have the right to send a notice to buyer to perform, and sequentially they can cancel. The effect of the assignment. If all of the above requirements are satisfied and the AOAA form is fully executed, then the assignment will be effective. Keep in mind that once the assignment has taken place, the assignee has approved, rectified all prior acts of the buyer in all transactions as if they were assigning, own, and agreed to perform all of the buyer's obligation in this agreement. The original buyer, however, is not released from the obligations or covenants of the agreement and could still be liable along with the assignee in the event of a breach of contract. All parties involved are advised to seek legal advice regarding the assignment, as a broker and an agent cannot advise on any potential legal or taxation that could arise. Okay. There's obviously additional resources that are straight from the California Association of Realtors, assigning contracts, okay? So now let me go into the actual form itself. on your zip forms. Okay. On the purchase agreement. When you click your purchase agreement, right? I want to stress and emphasize the importance here, right? Say you receive an offer, right? Offer from a buyer. Let me illustrate some information for you. So this is the purchase agreement right here, the California Residential Purchase Agreement. Okay, if you go to the grid, which is paragraph 3, terms or purchase or allocation of cost, there's a section on the grid under page 2, K23, assignment request. Okay, that is a contingency. And
Sorry,
if you-
Simon,
Yes.
are you sharing your screen? I cannot see it. It's all blank.
Oh, my apologies. Yes, I am, but let me try now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Okay, so under the RPA, under section K, page 2, 23, assignment request, it is considered a contingency. The contingency allows 17 days, or you could put or modify that if you request, right? Meaning that the buyer one submits an offer, within 17 days, they have to lift this as part of the contingency removal, okay? If you do not do anything, then it defaults to 17 days. The beauty of this purchase agreement is it gives you references now, okay? And that reference goes to page or paragraph 23. So on the grid, additional terms, an assignment can be done as illustrated on the presentation. I said, and I want to stress again, that a buyer can assign it to its own entity. It can assign it to its own corporation, LLC, trust. If the buyer wants to transfer it to someone totally different, it must be approved by the seller. It cannot, and I want to repeat again, it cannot be transferred to another person without the written consent of the seller. So if an investor comes in here, ties up the property and says, I'm going to wholesale it or sign it, and the seller never gave authorization, then the buyer would be in breach of the contract, and then now you can send up what's called a notice to perform. If the seller does agree to the assignment, then it must be in writing. Now buyer one can assign it to another party, and that other party can now officially close. Let's look at what 23 says about assignment. So if we navigate all the way to paragraph 23, we're almost there. Okay. 23, assignment nomination. Okay, I'm going to read it so you get a better understanding, folks. Buyer shall have the right to assign all a buyer's interest in this agreement to buyer's own trust or any wholly owned entity. So if I have my trust, I can do it. If I have a corporation, and let's say my corporation is Fly by Night LLC, and it's my corporation, I shall have the right to assign my interest to my own entity that is in existence at the time of such assignment, right? Remember, I have 17 days to be able to maneuver this, which I'm still in compliance and not in breach of the contract. Now, with that being said, I also want you to understand that you can extend that time frame as part of your responsibility, meaning that if it's 17 days that I must release this as part of the contingency, I can ask to extend it even further or reduce it as well. Then if you need to extend this because you still don't have it transferred over or agreed upon transfer to your own entity, then you must do what's called Form ETA. E is in Echo, T is in Tom, A is in Adam. That form is the extension of time addendum, okay? Otherwise, the buyer shall not assign all or any part of the buyer's interest in this agreement, okay? So if you don't transfer it to your own entity, then it's just you buying it and you closing the deal. Okay, buyer interest in this agreement without first having obtained a separate, so let me go back. Buyer shall not assign all or any part of buyer's interest in this agreement without first having obtained a separate written consent of seller to a specified assignee. Such consent shall not be unreasonable, okay? So just because I decide that I don't want to buy the property or close the property, I still have some rights to assign it to someone else. Okay, maybe I don't qualify for the loan. Maybe something happens where I cannot successfully close, but I still want this place. I can assign it to someone else. Maybe it's if it's a family member, brother, sister, parents, aunt, uncles, whoever it is, right? You can further contract, assign it to someone else. Okay, maybe some obligations came and you cannot close the deal. You can bring someone else to help, and that happens quite often. I go with the motion of tying up the property, right? And then I get notification from the lender that my front end and back end ratios are too high. And I might have to bring in a second party to help me qualify. Maybe I need additional income, right? Per the contract, you have 17 days to be able to assign it or bring someone else. If you remember what the presentation stated, right? The presentation stated that I can assign it. I can also bring someone or I can release someone. Let's say that it's me and my brother buying the property, then my brother decides he doesn't want to continue. I can take him off this agreement as part of the assignment. Or I can include my brother as part of the assignment and add him with me to qualify. The proper way of doing it is with the documentation in place, the assignment agreement, okay? So going back to what I was saying, without first giving and obtaining a separate written consent, meaning you have to get the approval from the seller in order for you to obtain this request. Such consent shall not be reasonable withheld prior to any assignment. Buyer shall disclose to seller the name of the assignee and the amount of any monetary consideration between buyer and assignee. Okay, this is crucial. This is important. This sets the tone of how to navigate this and ultimately not get yourself in a situation, a very sticky situation that you're practicing unethical with this assignment. Meaning that it is perfectly fine, right? And I know I sound like a broken record, but I want to emphasize and stress the importance because I don't want you to ever get yourself in a liability. That if I, as a buyer, right, let's say any of you represent me, right? I ask you to submit an offer on my behalf, but my whole intentions, right? My whole intentions is that I want to assign it to another person, right? And the whole purpose of me is because I really don't want to pursue this anymore, but I still want to, it's a great deal, but I can assign it to someone else and make compensation, right? What we call the wholesale. In order for that to be accomplished is we have to give a written consent to the seller saying that this is what our intention, full transparency, full disclosure will protect you, okay? As an agent, listing and also buyer agent. The seller says you're fine to assign it. Now the form will illustrate transparency. If I tie it up for 800,000, but then I assign it to someone else for 810, okay? That is a $10,000 difference, right? Because I tied it up for 8, but I'm selling it to the end user for 810. I'm making a $10,000. And that is perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong with that. But as long as the seller is aware, as long as we have written consent from the seller, it's perfectly fine. And we have the proper documentation in place, then yes, that buyer can assign it, and that buyer can also get a wholesaling fee from it as well. Okay. Escrow will know how to navigate that and ultimately cut checks to everyone. Okay. So buyer shall disclose to the seller the name of the assignee and the amount of any monetary consideration between the buyer and the assignee. Buyer shall provide assignee with all documents relating to this agreement. What is all, right? All disclosures, copies of the purchase agreement, any inspections that were done, anything in all, plus also any information about the new buyer, right? I'm not going to go in as a seller blindsided without any proof, who is this new person, right? Because originally the seller did not accept the second buyer. The seller accepted the first buyer, okay? So it's perfectly fine for the listing agent who represents the seller, right, to obtain additional information. Because the seller can say, nope, I don't agree to those terms, therefore, buyer 1 cannot assign it to buyer 2, and now you can send a notice to perform for buyer 1, and ultimately the buyer 1 has to decide what they want to do. Buy it or cancel, and the seller will be within their right to exercise that position. Okay. All right, where did I leave off? Buyer shall provide assignee with all the documents, right? But not limited to the agreement and any disclosures if assignee is a wholly owned entity or trust. Buyer that assignee does not need to re-sign or initial all documents provided. Whether or not an assignment requires seller's consent at the time of assignment, assignee shall deliver a letter from the assignee's lender that assignee is pre-qualified or pre-approved as specified in paragraph 6B as in boy. Should assignee fail to deliver such a letter, okay, seller, after first giving an assignee a notice to perform, shall have the right to terminate the assignment. Buyer shall, within the time specified in paragraph 3K, deliver any request to assign this agreement for seller consent. If buyer fails to provide the required information within the time frame, right, which is the 17 days, seller withholding of consent shall be deemed reasonable, meaning seller is within their rights. Any total or partial assignment shall not relieve buyer of buyer's obligation pursuant to this agreement unless otherwise agreed by seller. Meaning buyer 1 is still in the hook, okay? And what I mean by that, let's just go through the motions of it, okay? Buyer 1 submits an offer for 800,000, puts a $20,000 deposit. Okay, so there is a $20,000 deposit in escrow from buyer 1. Buyer one decides, after careful consideration, this home is going to cost me too much money or too much to repair it. Therefore, I'm going to get someone else that may want to purchase it. I then start researching and I start finding someone else that is, hey, I have this property on 123 ABC Street in the city of Torrance. I currently have it in escrow, but I wanted to see if you're interested in buying the property. Okay. Buyer number two comes and said, yeah, let me take a look at it. Okay, let me talk to my agent and see if we can do another showing. Remember, it has to be within your time period, right, of physical inspections, right, which is 17 days. Buyer's agent reaches the listing agent, says, hey, we'd like to do a quick check of the property. No problem. There's lockbox, bingo, bango, right? Buyer one meets buyer two at the property. Buyer two says, you know what? I like it. I want it. Okay. So buyer two asks buyer one, how much? Buyer one says to buyer two, I'll sell it to you for $810. Buyer two says, not a problem. I'm good with $810. Wonderful. Now I'm going to have my agent, buyer one's going to talk to buyer's agent and said, hey, I'm going to assign it to buyer number two. Buyer agent is still going to represent buyer two. They're still going to be able to work this. Buyer agent is still going to get a commission, okay, as long as everything stays in alignment. Okay. Buyer's agent reaches out to the listing agent, says, hey, there's been a change in the trajectory of this contract. My client, within their right, which is 17 days to assign it to another party, entity, trust, corporation, right? In this case, we're switching buyers. Buyer two is the one that's buying it for a higher price point, right? Buyer's agent on number one buyer is now requesting to the listing agent, hey, we're going to sign it. And then listing agent says, oh, okay. Let my seller know, right? So full transparency, full disclosure. Buyer's agent is now going to prepare form AOAA, right? So we're going to let escrow know that there's going to be an assignment, right? Full transparency, full disclosure. Now, let me go to, let me see, Parker shall, oops, where am I at? Shall have the right to terminate, wait, seller, after first giving the assignment notice to buyer, performer shall have the right to terminate the assignment, buyer shall within the time specified. So yeah, okay. Paragraph 3K, deliver and request to sign the agreement for seller consent. If buyer fails to provide the required information within the time frame, seller's withhold consent shall be deemed reasonable and total or partial assignment shall not be relieved. Okay, buyer's obligation pursuant to this agreement. Otherwise, the form AOAA party shall provide an assignment agreement to escrow. Okay, so here it is. My apologies. A lot of stuff going on here. Agreement that we're going to let escrow know within 1 day of the assignment, right? So if I'm telling you today is Friday, well, technically speaking, we should let the escrow know within 24 hours. So in this case, even though it's Saturday, you still want to send out an email to the escrow, even though they probably won't get it till Monday. Part of the agreement is within 1 day after the assignment, and any nomination by the buyer shall be subject to the same procedure, requirements, and terms as in the assignment. So basically, buyer one assigns it to buyer two. Buyer two has the same rights, okay, as buyer one. Nothing changes. Now let me go to the form. All right, do you see the new form? Do you see
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So this is the form assignment of agreement and amendment, okay, card form AOAA. Pretty self-explanatory. It incorporates it based on the purchase agreement, property address, buyer, seller's information. What this form says is the following: buyer and seller are referring to the parties, right? Buyer one, seller is referring to the parties. In consideration of this covenant contained herein, buyer hereby assigns to assigning, buyer one assigns, buyer two assigning, any assignees accept the assignment subject to seller's consent if required by the agreement of all or a partial interest, right? Because buyer one could still be in the game, as I illustrated earlier. What I mean is, I might need to bring my brother, my sister, my family members to help me qualify. And that's why it's saying that I might give partial, right? Because now I'm bringing someone else. But for the sake of today's class, I'm going to do it where I'm assigning all of my interest to someone else, meaning I am not going to close the deal. Okay? Someone else is going to close the deal. Buyer's right, title, and interest under this agreement, including without limitation, the right, title, and interest in any deposit or down payment upon the following terms and conditions. Okay, so this is where we get into the meat and potato of how this form can affect the process of the transaction. So it talks about partial or total assignment, meaning I'm bringing someone in, I'm taking someone out, or I'm cleaning my hands of transferring to someone else. 1A says partial assignment, adding a buyer. This is if I'm adding a buyer to help me. The buyer is added to the assigning named below to the agreement and granting such assigning a partial interest in this agreement. Section B, total assignment, new buyer replaces all original buyers. Buyer is assigning all buyer interests in the agreement to the assignee named below. Section C, other assignment, replacing a buyer, at least one original buyer remaining or deleting a buyer. Okay, that means that if I had two people buying the place, but now I don't need that other buyer, I can delete them off of this agreement. So remember, we can add, we can take, we can assign. We can assign to our corporation, LLC, or a trust, or I can take my whole interest and assign it to someone else. Assign all of the buyer's interest, agreement, and new remaining buyers, right? And then here, section D says assigning names. Okay, who is going to be added? If I check here, or if I check here, or if I check here, you're just going to put who are these people. If there's more than one, more than three, you can add them, right? You can say John Smith. Oh, excuse me. I don't know why it's not froze on me. So anyhow, okay. Section number 2 says prior documents. So now we kind of understand what we're planning to do up here, right? Section 1, now we're going into section 2. Section 2, prior documents, assigning shall initial the first page of each document and deliver to seller all of the transaction documents previously approved by the buyer, including but not limited to all contract documents, inspection reports, pamphlets, advisories, or disclosures within the time specified below. Unless otherwise agreed, assign acknowledge that all timeframes in this agreement remain the same, and no additional time shall be provided for any matter, including but not limited to investigations, review of documents, or close of escrow. So this still doesn't change the original agreement. If I say that I can close in 20 days, right? And I say that all contingencies will be from 17 days to 10 days, that still stays the same, even though I'm transferring it to someone else, I'm adding someone or taking someone, all of the original agreed upon, it still stays the same, okay? Delivery of prior disclosures. Section 2A1, prior documents already delivered to assignee. I already did it, right? Assignee acknowledged that the buyer has already provided assigning all prior documents. Section A2, prior documents not yet delivered to assignee, seller shall deliver to the buyer and assignee or seller signed copy of the assignment agreement addendum. Upon receipt of the seller's signed assignment, buyer shall immediately deliver to the assigning all prior documents. Okay. Disclaimer B, pre-qualification or pre-approval of assigning. Assigning has been pre-qualified or pre-approved by buyer's lender as per the agreement and a copy is attached. The requirement applies even if 1E is checked. Section C, time to return assignee initials prior documents. 1, initial copies of all prior documents are attached to this agreement. Okay, if you check number 2, assignee shall deliver initial copies of all prior documents to the seller within 3 days. It can also be modified. Okay, you can put 5 days. You can put 1 day, whatever the case may be, after seller delivers the assignee a copy of this agreement. If section 3(1)(e) is checked, delivery and return of prior document is not required because assignee is buying it under its own trust or its own entity. Okay, I'm the buyer. I'm just transferring it. There's no need for me to require documents because I'm still the one buying. I'm just transferring it to my trust. Section D is in David, effect of failure to return or attach documents. This is a disclaimer. Seller, after first delivering a notice to buyer to perform, may cancel this agreement and the assignment shall have no further force or effect. 1 and 2, prior documents, if assignee does not deliver to seller all prior documents within the time specified in 2C, right? We said 2C is within 3 days, right? Section 2 says pre-qualifications or approval. If assignee does not attach same pre-qualification or pre-approval from lender as required, then the seller has the right to send the notice to perform. If this is a cash deal, it still applies. Proof of funds, even though the existing buyer, right, provided proof of funds of cash, doesn't mean that buyer 2 has the proof of funds. Seller and listing agent can request from buyer number 2, show us proof that you have the means to close this deal. If it's a cash deal, you can request buyer 2 to provide us proof of fund. We don't have to rely on buyer 1 proof of funds. We can request buyer 2 proof of funds. Okay, section 3 goes into the actual wholesaling, what we call the spread, okay? And it says consideration for this assignment, 3A, 3B. If you check 3A, buyer has received or will receive consideration from assigning in the amount of, okay, this is where you're going to put the amount, right? As I said earlier, and I illustrated, right? I tied up the property for $800,000, but I'm assigning it to someone else as a buyer. Buyer 1 assigning it to buyer 2. Buyer 2 went and did their due diligence, wants to buy it, is good with everything. I sell it to buyer 2 for $810,000, right? $810,000. Then here, you're going to put the difference, $10,000 or a percentage, right? You can also do a percentage, but typically it's usually a flat, right? A difference between what I have it locked in and what I'm willing to sell it to the end user, right? Section B, buyer has not received and will not receive any monetary consideration from assignment. So if there is no assignment, meaning, listen, I'm buyer 1, I cannot continue with this, and the margins are very tight, I still can transfer it to buyer number 2. Buyer number 2 can say, I want it. what is it gonna cost me? Well, I'm in it at 800,000, I'll just sell it to you for 800,000. Okay? When that happens, then obviously you're gonna check 3B as in boy, saying that there is no consideration of receiving any monetary. I'm not making any spread or any wholesaling fees. Section 4. Assignee represents for the benefit of seller that the assignee ratifies and approves as assignee's own act for all prior approvals and acts of buyers pursuant to the agreement up to and include the date of this agreement. So what it means is, let's say Mr. and Mrs. Buyer number 2, right? I just want you to understand that you're representing and you're taking advantage of the benefits of what the seller has allowed you, approval of you now purchasing the property, that you have already got all of the prior approvals from buyer number 1 and you're good to go. So basically, buyer number 2 cannot sue, okay? Cannot sue the seller for information that was not provided, right? What this form says is you were given the right to do your due diligence within the time period. It's not my fault that buyer 1 didn't give you the ample amount of time, right? Because the original agreement still the original agreement still holds, right? If it's 30-day escrow, if it's a 20-day escrow, buyer number 2 can say, well, I just got it and I have 15 days to close this. It doesn't matter. You agree to it, you cannot ultimately alter it without the seller's concession. All right, so where did we leave? Number 5, assignee assumes and agrees to perform and observe all obligations covered in a buyer in this agreement to be performed after the date of assignment. Buyer acknowledges and agrees that without notwithstanding seller agreement to this agreement, buyer is not released from any obligation or covenant under this agreement. Meaning buyer 1 has that $20,000 deposit, that still stays in escrow, okay? That still stays in escrow. Meaning that the only way that buyer 1 can take that deposit is written instructions, okay? Meaning that buyer number 2 will put in their own funds into escrow to match buyer's 1 deposit. As an example, $20,000 deposit, I assign it to buyer number 2. Buyer 2 says, yes, I want to buy it. Okay, so buyer 2, you must put in matching the $20,000 so I can pull out my money out of escrow. All that has to be agreed upon. So what happens is before buyer 1's deposit is released to buyer 1, buyer 2 will now write or wire money into escrow for the amount of the original $20,000. Once escrow receives the $20,000, then escrow is now instructed to release buyer 1's deposit back to buyer 1's account, or what we call a hard check, right? So that still stays in place. So there's never a point that the seller doesn't, or excuse me, at one point, during this point, there is no issues that there will never be any money in escrow, right? Because there has to be consideration, right? And the consideration is the deposit that buyer 1 or even buyer 2 puts into escrow. I hope that kind of clears that question. If there's any additional terms, then obviously you can add it here on section 7. Section 8. Without releasing buyer from any obligations or covenants under this agreement and preserving all rights and remedies under this agreement in consideration of the covenant contained herein, seller consents to the foregoing assignment. The parties acknowledge and agree that they have been advised to review the assignment with a qualified California real estate attorney or an accountant prior to signing this agreement. The broker and agents makes no representation as to the adequacy, legality, or tax consequences of this agreement. By signing below, buyer assigns the agreement to assignee and signs accepts to the assignment of the buyer. buyer and assignee acknowledge that each have read, understood, received a copy of the agreement to the terms of this agreement. Okay, here is where you're going to put the buyer's information. Here, if it's an entity, right, if it's still going to be the buyer, but now they're going to put it into their own, right? Entity assigning. If this paragraph is completed, a representative capacity form, RCSD, is not required for the legality authorized sign. So what it says that if you are signing it to your own trust, corporation, S Corp, LLC, then you do not have to include the RCSD. Click here, it allows you to put whatever the assigning is, a trust, corporation, probate, partnership, holding, power of attorney, whatever the case may be. This agreement is being signed by legally authorized signer in a representative capacity and not for him, herself as an individual. Meaning that if I buy it as an individual, I have the right to assign it to my own entities. The legality authorized signer represents that the entity for which the person is acting already exists, and it's in good standing to the business in California and shall deliver to seller and escrow holder within 3 days of signing evidence of authority to act in this capacity. The names of the legal authorized signer, right? Then here is who is the person that's authorized on behalf of the trust, the corporations, or the LLC. If the entity is a trust under a probate, the following and is the full name of the trust or probate. So if it is, you write it all in. Okay. Assigning signature. Okay. So the assignee is the assignee that originally had the property and now is signing it to the new assignee. Their information goes there. Okay. This is the disclaimer, right? That ultimately, if buyer one is requesting to assign it to buyer number two, this needs to be filled out, okay? And it has to be approved by the seller. If the agent sends this over to the listing agent receives it, sends it to the seller, and the seller says, no, 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 I am not allowing this request. Assignment not accepted, then here the seller will initial. This assignment was not accepted by the seller on so-and-so day. Seller right to disapprove an assignment if applicable is established in this agreement. So meaning that the seller still has control. A buyer cannot just assign it to someone else without the written consent of the seller. This is the form that the buyer agent will fill, send to the listing agent. The seller has the right to yes or no to this assignment. If the seller says no, initial, date, send back to the buyer's agent saying, I am sorry, but the seller has declined the buyer's assigning this to another party. Therefore, does the buyer want to continue? Or does the buyer want to cancel? If you don't hear anything from buyer number one or the buyer's agent, then the only way the seller can cancel is by sending the buyer a notice to perform. Okay, one, if it's within their time period, right? Maybe they did not put a deposit, maybe they did not complete all of their inspection and it's time to release those. Then you can cancel based on that or this assignment, right? So remember, here's a strategy that I want you to understand when you are the listing agent and you get offers from investors, okay? When you're a listing agent and you get an offer from an investor, you'll know. Make sure to counter, right? I want you to counter that section on the RPA, right, that the assignment will be a lot less. So that allows the seller and the listing agent the control, right? Because remember, 17 days is a long time for this buyer to be fishing for other opportunities to assign it to someone else. So if you know it's an investor, you want to counter that as an avenue that the seller shall be able, excuse me, that the buyer shall be able to assign it, but not 17 days, but only 3 days, 2 days. Okay. So once you get the acceptance and you're in escrow, right, as an example, right? Then that 3 day comes, now the listing agent can send the buyer's agent a notice to release contingency on the assignment. And if they don't sign off on it, then the seller can send a notice to perform because now the buyer's in breach. But now it puts a buyer in position that, shoot, I only have 2 to 3 days to find someone else. And still, remember, the seller has to approve it. And if the seller doesn't approve it, then the buyer cannot assign it to another investor. But if it's their own entity, their own corporation, then the seller cannot decline that. They have to allow it. You don't need written consent. They still have to acknowledge and let you know, hey, by the way, Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, and listing agent, we're going to assign it to my client's corporation. Okay, not a problem. As long as it's their own entity and you can verify. Send me the articles of incorporation identifying that Simon Casares is the CEO, the president, the member, whatever the case may be, to make sure that it is that person's entity. And if they cannot provide it, and again, you go through the motions, I'm sorry, seller will not accept it. Okay, I hope that kind of makes sense and illustrates the position. So buyer one has an assigned property, and I, as an agent, have a buyer number 2. Where in the contract, if any, does the agent bring in buyer number 2? Okay, so there's nothing in the contract, right? Because let's say that I, being represented by a buyer, right? Buyer's agent. I submit the offer, seller accepts my offers. Now we're in escrow, right? Now, buyer number 1 is now looking to wholesale it or find someone else because they just cannot continue with the process. I might be calling people, or I might be calling another agent. Hey, I have this property in escrow. I'm just not going to be able to close. Are you interested in buying? So let's say that buyer number 2 is represented by another agent, right? This is where it gets a little tricky because remember, buyer 1 has its agent already submitted an offer. So the only way buyer number 2, who is represented by another agent, buyer number 2 has to get the request for some type of compensation from agent number 1, because agent 1 is getting a commission, not agent 2. So in order for this to work, because remember, buyer 1 is out. So that means if they're out, we cannot close this, I don't get paid. So I can probably agree with buyer agent 1 and buyer agent 2, which buyer agent 2 may come in with the buyer that can make this work. I might give buyer agent number 2 a referral or a partial of my commission because I'm still in it. Okay. Or you can say, unfortunately, no compensation to the buyer's agent, but if the buyer wants to buy, that buyer number 2 can pay the buyer's agent number 2 a commission. And that's where the buyer representation agreement comes into play. Okay. So that's how you maneuver through commissions, or if there's another agent involved. Remember, the buyer agent has to, in writing, provide this form. Immediately that you know that buyer 1 is not going to perform or wants to assign it, then this form must be completed and must be sent over to the listing agent. Hey, this is what the conversation would look like, right? So I would call the agent. Hey, Alex, this is Simon over at KW. And just wanted to let you know that my client, the buyer, is going to assign it to another buyer. Listing agent's gonna say, what happened? Okay, well, after doing their due diligence, unfortunately, the buyer is not comfortable, but they still want to assign it to another buyer. And we're asking for written confirmation or acceptance from the seller. We still can close, but we need the seller to be okay with that, right? So I will be sending you car form AOAA, right, immediately. So I'll draft it and then I'll send it over to the listing agent. The listing agent is going to receive it and then going to have a conversation with the seller, right? The seller, and the seller is going to say, well, what does this mean? Okay, now you need to know how to deliver that conversation with the seller, because the seller is like, what are you guys doing here? I thought we were going with buyer number one. Well, the contract allows the assignment, right? So the listing agent is going to have a conversation with the seller and says, well, it looks like the buyer is not going to go and continue with the process, but is requesting if we can assign it to another person. If the seller says not a problem, we could go ahead and do so. Then we just need written confirmation, right? That the seller is okay to assign it, to another party, and this is where the seller will sign right here. Okay, if the seller doesn't approve it, they're still going to sign, but they're also going to initial here, assignment does not accept. Okay. If they do accept and agree to the assignment, then the seller would just sign and leave this completely blank. Okay. Now remember, full transparency, right? If the buyer, one, is going to make any consideration of compensation, then we must disclose that, right? Under this paragraph right here, section number 3, and whatever the amount is. Because somehow, some way, if you do not divulge that information, escrow is going to have all the documentation in place. Seller's going to know, and that can open up a can of worms for a potential lawsuit for not disclosing buyer's one intentions of collecting a spread or a difference, right? And I was just as an illustration, just giving you, a difference of 10,000. Okay, it can be more or it can be less or it can be zero compensation, but you have to provide this as part of the seller disclosure. I hope that kind of makes sense. All right, so Brooke, you have so to get clarified, say that the seller accepts the buyer one is selling for 10,000 more than buyer one, just get to make 10,000 off the sale. Then from the agent commission, is that based off of 8 or 810? Okay, so good question. Remember, in this situation, you went into contract at 800,000, right? Now, buyer number one is going to assign it to buyer number 2. Buyer number 2 is going to pay $10,000 more, right, than buyer 1. And let's say that at 800,000, the commission was going to be, say, 15,000. But now at 810, the commission is, let's just say, 10,500, or you know what I mean, right? So how it's based on and how they calculate it is based on the amount that we're going to officially close. Because on record, right, it's not going to record at 800,000 price point. It's going to record at 810 price point. So therefore, everyone's commission gets increased to the number that is assigned to at this consideration, it's 810. Okay, does that make sense? Did I?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brooke. Yeah, so basically, even if it's say 50,000, right? I secured it for 800 and then I assigned it for 850, right? That's a 50,000. So, but we're closing at 850. Remember, because the buyer too is buying it for a higher price point. When it officially reports, it's going to report at 850. So therefore, if there is no written agreement, then the seller will be obligated to pay the commission based on 850. Now, and that's a good point and a good indicator, Brooke, is that if the listing agent and the seller says, look, I don't mind and I'm okay, meaning the seller, I'm okay, but I still want to keep the commission based on 800. Then the listing agent will have to draft an addendum to actually specifying we're selling it for 850, but commission percentage will be based on the 800 price point, and both parties agree to, then ultimately the commission will stand as the original 800,000, but it has to be in writing. Okay? Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, well, that pretty much wraps up the conversation regarding assignment. Any questions you have? And if you do have questions, please don't hesitate, reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to explain it. But it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, they're going into the avenue of it, of assigning. And remember, let me go back to the purchase agreement, just so you get some clarity. And I apologize if I'm going a little over my time. Do you see my my screen with the purchase agreement?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to this section here. Okay, 1 second. Oops, my bad. Where is assignment? Here. Okay. So again, I want you to be smart, but I also want you to understand how this works. If you get an offer that is coming from an investor or a corporation, you already know that this section is 17 days. Okay. This section. I would encourage you to protect your client's position and tighten up the condition for the buyer. If you know it's an investor submitting an offer, maybe it's a rehab property, but you're concerned and as a listing agent that this buyer may assign it to someone else, right? Then the way you protect your client is very simple. You see how it says 17 days? You're going to submit a counteroffer saying the counteroffer shall be based on the assignment saying something to this nature, right? On the seller counteroffer, right? You're going through negotiations, right? You're going to say something like this. Section K, paragraph 23, assignment of request shall be 1 day. Or you can say shall assignment request shall be deleted from this agreement. Okay, so now what that means is that the buyer cannot use this to assign it if you're saying 0 days or if you're reducing it from 17 days. And a lot of agents don't think of this, but remember, they have 17 days to assign it. Now, even if you forget, okay, it still has to be agreed upon by the seller. So even though you don't and leave it at 17 days and they're fishing for another buyer, they still need to get the written consent of the seller, right? And the seller can say, nope, I'm rejecting that. So you either buy it or we cancel. Okay. They cannot unilaterally just assign it to someone else and think that the seller is going to be okay. But it's your job to understand every parameter to these agreements. You can tighten up the contingencies and reduce the 17 days down to 1 day. Then after 1 day, then you can send a notice to perform to release assignment or request. Okay, and let me show you what the contingency. I love contracts. It's so much fun. So contingency. Oh, my thing froze up, so let's see. I can't either. Yeah, it's not, oh, here it goes. Okay, wait a minute. All right, so contingency of buyer, right? Let's say that you only allow 1 day. So here's, can you see my screen? Buyer contingency?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So let me see here. Loan, appraisal buyers, investing only part of the investment investigation. But all right, so here, what you're gonna do is you're gonna request for the buyer. Deal seller to spoil approve land, review of lease, entire contract. So you can go under section I. Okay. Click here and then request the buyer to release assignment. And you're gonna type here, okay? Because I was trying to see if there was an actual assignment release, but it goes into entire buyer's investigation, only part of the investigation, all buyer investigations, fire, flood, and others, review of seller disclosures, statutory disclosures, comment review, no buyer sells the property, loan appraisal contingency, condos or some. Okay, so then, yeah, you would check this and then type in the assignment agreement, okay? And then you send this over to the buyer's agent, and then the buyer has to sign that off. So now they cannot use that to assign it to someone else. I hope that helps. All right, so great information. Thank you, Simon. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, that pretty much concludes. If you have any additional questions, by all means, please don't hesitate, reach out to me. Have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful weekend, and I will see you in our next contract class. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, thank you.